Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative and creative individuals who are helping to shape the future of the American West. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, pretty much anyone who's doing important work that makes the West such a special place to live, work, and play. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to the podcast and to all of you who've shared it with your friends and family. If you haven't already, please take 30 seconds to send it out on your social networks or to email it to a friend. As I've said before, a recommendation from a close friend is always the best endorsement, so I'd really appreciate your continuing to help spread the word. I'm really excited about my guest today. His name is Jim Howell, and he fits into almost all the categories I mentioned just a moment ago. He's a rancher, a writer, a conservationist, an entrepreneur, and an athlete. He's also an experienced world traveler and an expert in ecology and natural history. Jim is the CEO of Grasslands, LLC, which is the land management arm of the Savory Institute, an organization that Jim co-founded. Both Grasslands and Savory are focused on conserving and restoring the world's grasslands through what they call holistic management. In our conversation, we dig into all the details of holistic management, but the basic idea is that grasses of the world evolved to be grazed, and they need to be grazed to be healthy and resilient. Jim and his team used livestock to mimic the natural grazing patterns from hundreds of thousands of years ago, long before the world's grasslands were covered with people, fences, houses, and cities. Savory and Grasslands results speak for themselves. After just a few years of holistic management, their ranches are healthier, have more biodiversity, are more productive, and more financially successful. Even if you have absolutely no interest in grazing or ranches or cows, you still need to listen to this interview. The work Jim is doing has a positive effect on land, people, animals, and communities all around the world, and I think anyone who loves the outdoors and is conservation-minded needs to understand Jim's work. I have no doubt that you'll gain a new appreciation for the role that livestock needs to play in conserving grasslands around the world. Even if you're a vegan living in New York City, you'll gain some valuable insights from Jim's point of view. Several years ago, I read Jim's book, For the Love of Land, and it completely shifted my perspective on the importance of grazing for conservation, the environment, communities, and local economies. I highly recommend it to anyone with an interest in the West or in land conservation in general. I've got a link to it in the episode notes on the webpage. I prepared 2 pages of questions for Jim, and we only scratched the surface, but we still managed to talk about a lot. We talk about the details of his work at Grasslands and Savory, as well as some of the specific methods that they use to restore grasslands around the world. We dug into the details of natural history and ecology and talk about how grasses and animals evolved together over millions of years. We talk about some of Jim's travels around Africa, South America, and New Zealand, as well as his non-traditional path into the ranching business. Jim is also an ultra runner, and he's run some of the more challenging 50-mile races in Colorado, so we talk a lot about that. As usual, we talk about favorite books, documentaries, locations in the West, and a ton of other interesting information. I thought it was a fun and in-depth conversation, and I really appreciate Jim taking the time to chat. No joke, I could have asked him questions for 8 more hours straight. Jim's work has been enormously influential on my career in ranch brokerage and in land conservation, and he's got a very important perspective on a subject that needs to be understood by more people. So I hope you enjoy the interview. Thanks again for listening, and here's Jim Howell. All right, so I guess the first question I'd ask, or the first question I've been asking people is, when you meet somebody for the first time and they ask you what you do for a living, what do you tell them?
Well, I say I'm a rancher, which is where I still identify with. And at the end of the day, even though I'm not a day-to-day family rancher anymore, I lead a ranch management company. So I guess I say I'm the leader of a ranch management company now. That's my main gig at the moment.
And so what ranch management company?
It's called Grasslands, LLC. We're kind of an offshoot of the Savory Institute that we'll probably talk about here in a minute. But it's a group that was founded by Alan Savory and various other friends of ours, including my wife and I. And Grasslands is an entity that's was conceived to go out and raise investor capital from investors that are interested in investing in large-scale ranches. So we go out and find the ranches. We kind of put the deals together in conjunction with the real estate teams, and then facilitate getting them over the line, getting them closed, and then we engage in long-term management contracts on the ranches that we get bought. So we contract with the entity that ends up buying the ranches. And our investors are mostly high net worth individuals that are interested in a long-term store of capital, as well as they're all interested in actually making money off the ranches as well. They're not just recreational ranches that lose money. They're actual ranches that are good, commercial, productive ranches that can generate a competitive annual dividend also.
So what do you guys do that's different from your average run-of-the-mill ranch management company?
Well, there aren't too many ranch management companies out there that I'm aware of. There's a handful. Most of them actually are kind of geared around the stuff that we do, which is all based on the work of Alan Savory, who was this Zimbabwean guy, actually Rhodesian when he lived there, back when Zimbabwe used to be Rhodesia, who came up with some key insights that really facilitate more efficient and ecologically sound management of large-scale ranches. And that more efficient ecological management translates into economic improvement as well. And so he's called holistic management because it tries to tie in cultural and social considerations along with economic considerations, along with ecological considerations, and trying to make decisions that are simultaneously sound from all three of those angles. So there's a lot involved with it, and it's kind of nuanced and it's complex, and it takes a long time to figure out and learn. But if you stick to it, it definitely gives you a leg up, and yields a significant advantage, in all realms. But the main way is economically, because we can end up effectively doubling our stocking rates, kind of on average, taking into account tough years and the good years, kind of average through time. We tend to be able to double our stocking rates. In other words, the number of cattle that we can run on the same land base relative to more conventional management. And there's a lot that goes into that we might talk about here. But at the end of the day, that's what our company is founded on, is this holistic management approach to land management. Yeah.
And so you could obviously, all those points you hit, there have been dozens and dozens of books written on each point. So we were just saying this, kind of comical to try to discuss all this in an hour. But what I want to do is kind of give a good overview so that people who aren't familiar with any of this can, get a decent understanding of kind of why what you guys are doing is so important. So I think maybe the first overview, just from an ecological standpoint, is could you talk a little bit about why grasslands are important? Because I think, you go anywhere in the U.S. and most people, educated people, would know that the jungles are important and the oceans are important. But I think even people living here in the West don't have an appreciation for why the grasslands are so important. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
So the grasslands in aggregate globally comprise about 40% of the lands of the Earth's surface area, land surface area. So it's about 5 billion hectares, or 12 billion acres. So it's a massive chunk of the world, and that doesn't include the big deserts of the world, like Sahara and the Namib and the heart of the Gobi. Those aren't included in the grasslands. So Savory would include those in kind of manageable grasslands, and that they've been desertified by human management. But if you even take those deserts out, there's still 12 billion acres of grasslands around the world, and those support about 2 billion people. And the grasslands themselves are the most under-conserved kind of biome globally. A lot of the best grasslands have been converted into monoculture cropping. Like the Midwest, former tall grass prairie belt in the United States is almost 100% corn and soybeans now. It's almost no tall grass prairie left. Same thing in like the Pampas of Argentina. It's mostly been converted to corn and soybeans. So the productive grasslands of the world are almost gone. And then the marginal grasslands, much of them have been converted into wheat. And then the marginal grasslands in the semi-arid and arid areas, kind of the stuff that we would call steppe grasslands, tend to be highly degraded because of poor livestock management, especially over the last few hundred years. But this is going back till since we domesticated livestock 5,000+ years ago. So there's been this gradual, incessant degradation of the world's grasslands through time. As a result, we've lost huge amounts of ecological integrity and biological diversity across these landscapes. And so the grasslands themselves are huge stores of this biodiversity, huge stores of soil carbon. And again, they support 2 billion people. So a huge source of food as well. And not just food from livestock production, but also food from grain production, because again, most of the grain produced in the world comes from what originally were grasslands. So they comprise a extremely important component of our both biodiversity globally as well as our food production capacity.
Okay, and I think in your book, one of the best chapters that I think about all the time, that I, despite all my classes in college and all that stuff, it never sunk into my skull. Mm-hmm. But can you talk a little bit about just the history of grass? We'll just leave it in the United States, mm-hmm. and how the grass has evolved to be grazed, and just kind of give us mm-hmm. a quick natural history lesson on that.
So most of these grasslands are in environments that we would call brittle tending in holistic management. So this is a concept that actually Savory kind of pieced together in the brittle savanna tropical grasslands of Zimbabwe and Zambia in the 1960s. So these are landscapes that, because of the nature or the pattern of the precipitation, either it's very erratic, meaning it's highly unpredictable how it falls over the course of a year, or it's very seasonal and concentrated, which means that for a big part of the year there is no rainfall, which means there's no humidity at the soil surface level for most of the time. As a result of that, there's very little biological activity out in the ambient environment. And because of that, very little biological decay of carbon takes place. So all this above ground biomass that grows during the growing season, when it quits raining, it goes dormant. It's kind of creates a standing haystack. If that carbon is not cycled, it's still standing there when it starts raining again the following year. Mm-hmm. And so that above ground accumulation of biomass gradually becomes a liability to that plant, because grass plants grow back from their plant bases. The growth points are around the plant base. So if you have this bulk of biomass shading the growth points at the base of the grass plant, it inhibits the vigor and the full expression of that grass plant. And a lot of grasses over-rest to death. They die after multiple years of not having been defoliated. So in these brittle environments, characterized by that seasonal nature of the precipitation or erratic nature of the precipitation, they evolved with these big carbon cycling herbivores. So that's where there is moisture and heat all year long, is in the gut of the grazing animal. And so those animals complete that step in the circle, in the kind of the life cycle of birth, growth, death, and decay. The herbivores create that decay step there via their digestive process. So it's an amazing, really evolutionary step, the fact that these animals evolved that have a rumen that can take in feedstuffs that are high in cellulose, it's undigestible to everything else. And because of the gut microflora in their rumens, can break that down into volatile fatty acids that the animals then use for their own energy and sustenance. And then they break the rest of that carbon back down into a form, dung and urine, that's more readily incorporated back into the topsoil. And so they effectively cycle this carbon during the dormant season. And so that essential step of decay, cycling that carbon, is performed by these herbivores. So this is something that Savory realized, like, wow, these animals are essential to these landscapes. And when you remove them, these landscapes, instead of getting better, they might get better for a few years if they've been in an overgrazed, kind of hammered condition, but eventually they start to revert and go backwards again due to too much rest, mm-hmm. too much, a lack of disturbance and grazing activity. So the presence of those animals is critical, but the main thing is not just the presence of the animal, it's how the animal is behaving out there in the landscape. So that's something that Savory also pieced together in Zimbabwe and Zambia in the 50s and 60s as a game ranger. He was in very remote, very pristine parts of what's now Zambia, was northern Rhodesia at the time. And they were areas that had never been settled by human pastoralists because of the presence of the tsetse fly, which causes sickness in domestic livestock. As a result, the huge assemblage of native herbivores in conjunction with their pack-hunting predators were still out there in big numbers throughout these landscapes. And Alan eventually realized, wow, these landscapes that are still interacting or still functioning the way nature intended, with big herds of herbivores plus all the pack-hunting predators, at the end of the day are the most ecologically vigorous and resilient relative to all the areas that were settled by European ranchers, where most of their livestock or the wild animals were largely removed, replaced by lower numbers of sedentary livestock. The vigor of the plants, the diversity of plants, the nature of the soil surface, all that tended to show a more degraded condition through time in the ranching setting relative to the wild setting, even though the effective stocking rate in form of actual total animal biomass out on that landscape was higher in the wild setting relative to the commercial ranching setting. So Alan gradually pieced together that it's the behavior of these animals that's critical, and the behavior is primarily stimulated by the presence of the predator, pack-hunting predators, which tend to keep animals bunched as a defense mechanism against that predation. And because they're bunched, they tend to dung and urinate in fairly concentrated fashion. No animal likes to feed on areas where it's dunged and urinated. So animals are constantly fouling ground, and because of that, that stimulates them to constantly move on the fresh ground. And in a natural context, what tends to happen is that after that fouling and grazing and disturbance, the animals tend not to come back to those spots until those plants have had the chance to fully recover. In other words, grow back from that disturbance and grazing event. And so in the United States, in North America, a similar dynamic existed since the end of the Pleistocene, a couple million years ago. 10,000 years ago, 2 million to about 10,000 years ago. I'll talk about that in a second, but just since 10,000 years ago, when the first Europeans got to North America, we all know they encountered these massive herds of bison across the West, across the Great Plains especially, but also enormous herds of elk and mule deer and bighorn sheep and pronghorn in the western states. And if you go back and there's some trappers' diaries from the early 1800s that describe these populations of animals, even in the western kind of intermountain and Great Basin areas, that are kind of hard to believe, the number of bighorn sheep and pronghorn and mule deer that they describe migrating across these landscapes. And we all know the accounts of the early explorers throughout the Great Plains and the bison, numbers of bison that they saw. But it was the same thing. All these animals were kept bunched and moving due to wolves, due to predation pressure. In the arid West, a lot of the migrations of these animals were driven by getting to predator, the least dense predator areas to calve and lamb, have their babies over a short, concise period where there weren't too many wolves, and then they'd take off in their migration again. So there were all these amazing dynamics that kept animals moving, kept them concentrated, but kept them moving, which is not the same as we tend to practice in our commercial ranching settings, when the cattle tend to be set stocked for extended grazing periods in the same areas. What happens then is the grass plants get grazed. The same grass plants tend to get grazed over and over again. So grass plants might get grazed severely, meaning fairly tight to the ground. That's not a problem, as long as that grass plant has a chance to then fully recover its area, its leaf area and root mass before it gets grazed again. But what tends to happen, since the animals aren't moving, is that grass plant starts to grow back, and the animal will immediately come back and graze that new fresh regrowth, because that's where the most digestible protein and energy is. So if that grass plant gets continuously grazed like that, eventually it depletes its carbohydrate reserves in its root system, and either it changes its growth form so that it grows prostrate along the ground, or it just becomes stunted and tight to the ground, or it dies, depending on the species. So we tend to get landscapes that are dominated by plants that are resistant to this continuous overgrazing, where that exists. But typically we have that in conjunction with overrest right in the same pasture, because a plant that doesn't get grazed tends to develop this above ground biomass, which becomes low in digestibility, and it's repulsive to the animal. So obviously the animal is going to come and graze the salad that's been sitting there for 3 years relative to the fresh leafy green that just starting to grow back. So you get these two negative grazing patterns, overgrazing and overrest in the same pasture. But if you have big herds of animals that are grazing fairly evenly across the landscape in a short, intense bout of grazing and then moving on and potentially not coming back for years, 2 years, sometimes we manage grazing periods in our lower production kind of semi-arid environments. You can eliminate those negative grazing patterns and get all the benefits of that natural pulse of disturbance and grazing combined with the recovery period that imitates nature.
Mm-hmm. That's why you wrote a 500-page book on it.
Exactly. That's the basic idea, though.
Yeah, that's the basic idea, and it makes perfect sense when you think about it. And one of the things we were talking about last week is that for some reason, and maybe it's because of the overgrazing or the fact you mentioned that if a property has been overgrazed or a piece of land has been overgrazed, and you take the cows off, it grows back. But then a few years later, it's going to be worse off because of it. Mm-hmm. But in general, when I talk with people, either in the conservation world or in the environmental world, one of the general, kind of overview ideas is that cows are bad for property, or grazing is bad for property, and that if you ask the average environmentalist or conservationist, you said, how do you think we could make this ranch more ecologically diverse, they would say take cows off of it, take every animal off it, and let it be wild. And so what you're saying is that we need these cows on there because the grasses have evolved to be grazed. And I think in your book, one of the best illustrations of it is that you have a photo in there of a fence line, and there's private land on one side that's been grazed, and then there's I believe it's a national park on the other side where they don't allow grazing. Can you explain that photo and the background on that?
So I think that might be in Canyonlands National Park. So Canyonlands it's up on what they call the island in the sky between the Colorado River and the Green River, where they merge in Canyonlands. And as you come onto that part of the park, you come across this plateau up there, the island in the sky, and you go through what is somebody's winter grazing allotment, and then you go in, and then you cross into the park. And you get into the park, and it looks like there's a lot of grass out there. But when you get out, and there is, but when you get out and walk out into it, you realize that it's mostly dead Indian rice grass. And maybe 10 or 20% of the plants are still kind of hanging on. But if you look down into that biome, into that sward of grass, they're mostly overrested gray material standing there, and you can just pull those plants out of the ground. And there's very little diversity there. You go onto the side of the fence that is still somebody's grazing allotment, even though it's not necessarily a well-managed grazing allotment. It's getting grazed periodically, mostly in the winter, I think, in that area. And every plant is alive. There's greater species diversity, and none of the plants are dead. They're maybe not as vigorous as they could be because probably the timing and the intensity of grazing isn't managed like it could be, but the presence of livestock there periodically is keeping that landscape alive. Whereas in the national park side, it's an overrested, decadent mess. And there's a lot of cryptogamic crust growing out in that national park side, which conservationists, environmentalists are really hot on. And definitely there's a value associated with the cryptogamic crust. But you get cryptogamic crust dominating a landscape. From our perspective, it's nature's way to cover that soil surface in the total absence of disturbance. So if you're a mule deer or a chipmunk or a deer mouse or a cow or a bighorn sheep, it's pretty hard to make a living on cryptogamic crust. It is good in an area that's impossible to disturb. It's nature's way of covering the soil. But where you get this periodic pulses of disturbance, the cryptogamic crust doesn't form, but you get grass and other plants covering the soil instead, which, again, from the point of view of any type of herbivore, from a deer mouse to an elephant, grass is better than cryptogamic crust. So the environmental perspective, for the most part, the conservationist perspective is that, like you said, you got to take the animals away, let it rest, let it recover. And if it's been an abused, kind of hammered landscape under high stocking rate, continuously grazed, yeah, you get this flush of regrowth and recovery that happens post removal of the livestock. But depending on the nature of the environment, through time, that is a negative influence on that land, that total lack of disturbance, because of the stuff I've already talked about, this accumulation of above ground biomass, the lack of disturbance of the soil surface, which plants seeds, punches prostrate, decaying plant litter into the soil where it can decay quicker, and create microsites for germination. All these great things happen if the disturbance happens in the right way. So it's not the presence of the cow that's the problem. It's how the cow or the sheep or any of these domestic animals are interacting with the landscape. And so they're a tool, just like any tool can be used to tear something down or build something up. And so if it's a tool that's managed in the appropriate way, there's wonderful things that can result from it. And when I say appropriate way, again, it's just in this way of mimicking nature, mimicking this natural movement that would have been happening out there in a natural context. So, there's also this whole thing about, what you're looking at the soil surface level and kind of in intimate detail at the soil surface level. Very few people are really trained in what to look for. And this is another thing that Savory has made us conscious of, is thinking about the soil surface level from the soil surface from the perspective of effectiveness of ecosystem processes. So we're talking about the water cycle, and which is how well the water is soaking into the soil as opposed to running off or evaporating. A bare soil surface with a hard cap on it, which is very typical of undisturbed landscapes, is very prone to surface runoff, and what doesn't run off tends to evaporate right off that bare soil surface. Whereas a disturbed landscape that has healthy grass cover, that has decaying prostrate plant litter in between the plant bases, it's like having your skin over your muscle tissue. If you peeled your skin away, your muscle tissue immediately starts to dehydrate. But if you have the skin on your muscle stays hydrated. Same way with the soil profile in a grassland. If it's covered with plants, living plants, and decaying plant litter, when it rains on that surface, that litter impedes surface runoff, and what does soak down into the soil surface, then that litter impedes evaporative loss out of the topsoil. So thinking about just looking at the soil surface, and most conservationists will just look at species. What species are there? Are the right species here? They don't think about the structure of those different species. Are they happy? Are they vigorous and full of healthy, vigorous leaves, lots of live canopy cover? Or is it a decadent, overrested plant sitting there dying? Could be the same species, but what's the structure of that species? Another ecosystem process is the mineral cycle. How is that biomass cycling from not just the biomass, but also the minerals in the soil, in the soil? And there's specific things you can look at to try to determine if the mineral cycle is happening in an efficient and effective way or not. And typically in these types of environments, if there's not big herbivores present to fill this important step of decay that we've talking about and disturbance, you tend to have a stuck mineral cycle because that decay component isn't happening effectively. There's also community dynamics, we used to call succession, which is just the diversity of life out there. In a periodically disturbed environment, you get all this wonderful microsites for germination that make possible the germination of all kinds of seeds that otherwise lay there dormant. And so, for example, in our ranches that we manage in South Dakota and Montana, all across all of our biological monitoring transects that we have out there, which measure the effectiveness of these ecosystem processes I'm talking about, our species diversity has increased by 72% across our transects. So we go out and we count how many species are showing up in these loops that we put down across the 200-foot transects, and so our species in just 6 years has increased by 72%.
Wow.
And our plant basal cover, so the amount of area covered by actual living plant base, which means that the higher the plant basal area, the more dense the plants, has increased by 34%. So we're getting more plants of greater diversity as a result of impacting the landscape this way. And so looking at those kind of subtle changes at the soil surface, once you have your kind of eye trained to know what to look for, all these things start to make sense. But most conservationists aren't trained in the health of the ecosystem processes or the effectiveness of the ecosystem processes. They're just trained in species and species diversity. So they're trained wonderfully in that sense. It's great to go out with somebody, a botanist, that really knows the species on a landscape. They teach me all kinds of stuff. But they're not looking at the landscape from the perspective of management and functionality of rainfall, functionality of mineral cycling, how the energy is flowing through plants, how much solar energy you're actually capturing across that landscape. All that stuff are subtleties that we look for when we think about land management.
So when you buy a ranch or when you take over managing a ranch, and even very experienced ranchers, the ones that I've run into plenty who just throw the cows out in the pasture and leave them, come back a few months later. Can you give us just kind of an overview of what you guys do? How do you make the animals graze as they naturally would have, millions of years ago?
Right. So we don't repopulate the ranches with wolves and expect it all just to self-organize and work like nature intended. Unfortunately, all these landscapes are now highly fragmented. It's really not feasible to reintroduce predators across most of these landscapes because they're too fragmented. There's too many roads, too many people, too many livestock. It just doesn't work. But we still have to have the herbivore there interacting with the landscape. So the human, with its associated tools, has to come in and stimulate and try to mimic that movement that the predators would have originally done. So we do a lot of portable electric fencing. We build almost no new fence, especially in the kind of these western landscapes, because it's just cost prohibitive to build new barbed wire fence. It just doesn't make any sense. Even to build new electric fence doesn't make any sense. But you can do these. There's really cheap, incredibly effective electric fencing technology that enables you to build basically any size pasture at any time, anywhere on the ranch. And so we have this grazing planning process that Savory developed by working with hundreds of ranchers throughout Africa and South America in the 60s and 70s, and then it continued with the evolution of that work in the 80s when he immigrated to the U.S. And so this is a step-by-step planning process that entails all kinds of factors. Savory actually developed it from a military planning exercise, which is, going into a very complex, potentially chaotic situation. You would never go into a military battle without a really good plan, but you always know that your plan isn't going to actually work out as planned because the battle never evolves the way you exactly predict it. So you have to have the plan, though. That doesn't mean you don't plan. You still have this wonderful plan.
I heard a quote the other day. I think it was Mike Tyson or somebody said, "Everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face."
Exactly. But even those boxers, they've planned and prepared for when they get punched in the face on how to control and monitor and potentially replan if they have to during the course of the fight. And there's huge preparation that goes into getting ready for that fight. Well, the same thing as getting ready for a grazing season or for a military battle. So the planning process that we have takes into account the livestock needs. Obviously, livestock physiological needs vary throughout the year, whether the cow is a dry cow in the winter, not lactating, or when it's approaching the last 3 months of gestation relative to when it has its calf, first 3 months of gestation or of lactation, or higher demand when she's trying to build back body condition and build back her ability to reconceive again and get bred again 3 months after she's had the calf. So there's all these physiological factors that go into the plan that dictate, or not dictate, but that influence where we have the animals during these different physiological states of the year, for example. There's also the needs of the plants and the recovery periods that plants need between grazing events before we come back. So recovery period goes into the plan. Recovery periods are different depending on the elevation and the slope and the aspect and whether it's irrigated or not. So all those different recovery period needs go into the plan. All different kinds of potentially specific needs of specific pastures there might, or things to look out for in specific pastures. Like in our high altitude country in Colorado, we have a lot of larkspur problems in June. So in certain pastures, so you know all that stuff on the plan, where to avoid during this time. If we're really trying to stimulate elk populations, because a big part of our income is by guiding elk hunts in the fall, and we want to stimulate elk on our ranch, we try to not to influence the elk when they're in the midst of calving. For example, we have big areas on the ranch we used to lease that tend to be dominated in June by calving elk mamas. So we just work that into the grazing plan and avoid those areas during that time of the year. So there's all these considerations that go into the plan.
How long would it take you to understand a piece of property? I know you're learning more every day you're out there, but in general, when you walk onto a ranch, how long does it take you to say, all right, I can start making my plan now?
Well, you can come up with a plan from day one with the best knowledge that you have, and that's a big, the knowledge that the previous owners and managers have of a landscape. It's definitely highly valuable.
Sure.
When I go in and do a consulting job with the new ranch, the guys that are sitting there at the table that have been at the ranch for years or potentially decades, their place-specific knowledge is absolutely essential to coming up with the best plan. When we go on with Grasslands, though, to a new property, usually the previous owner isn't sitting there at the table with us as we do the plan. We try to glean as much as we can from him before the transition takes place. But you can make a plan from day one, but as the years go on, your plans get progressively way more refined and much better.
More data every year.
You get more data, and you just learn what works. There's a lot of logistical considerations that go into implementing a grazing plan. It's not that easy, especially in kind of tough mountain country. The logistics of getting a big herd of animals from one pasture to another is frequently challenging, and so.
Well, you take all that complex, all the complex ecology and the logistics, and then you put HR on top of that. You got to find people that will,
totally,
good workers to help you.
Exactly.
And so, it's just unbelievably complex.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother can of worms there, because ranchers and cowboys tend to be very proud of their lifestyle and their knowledge base, and understandably, there is a lot of wonderful knowledge there. But there also tends to be resistance to anything that might question whether or not the way that a person has been doing something his whole life might have some flaws in it. And so just the human component of this is really tough. And so we try to attract guys onto our teams that are open-minded and that are kind of already in our holistic management network, that have an appreciation of this stuff. Now we're getting into second-generation holistic management guys. My main partner in Grasslands is a guy named Zachary Jones from Montana, and his dad was on the first holistic management board that Savory set up in the early 80s in North America. Yeah. And so Zach's a second-generation holistic guy, so this just all is the way he grew up, and it's not, you don't have to reteach him anything. But that's not the case in most places. So it's tough. You need to be a truly just a functional human being, realizing that you can still have a lot to learn, and just have an open mind, and we also are quite humble when we start going into this as well, into a plan. One thing that's critical to making all this work is to assume that our plan is wrong, because it's guaranteed to be wrong, and to not, just because you put all this effort into devising the plan to begin with, doesn't mean that you then stick to the plan rigidly, because it's guaranteed to fail if you do. So you have to have the humility to assume you're wrong, and then be out there monitoring for the first warning signs that you've misplanned something, and then have the discipline to correct and control, and if needed, scrap your plan and start over. That's the hardest part, is the implementation side. You can get guys to sit down around a table and do the plan, but then adjusting the plan as needed through time, it's really hard. And also seeing how it takes a lot of kind of abstract thinking, because you're thinking multiple months down the line throughout this planning window, and trying to evaluate, how does the decision that I make today impact the execution of this whole plan? And that's hard for a lot of guys to do. And not everybody has to do that, but there's a few people out there that are really good at this spatial, temporal, abstract thinking component that goes into this. So we need those kinds of skill sets out here across these landscapes, and those are rare.
I think skills. It's rare in any business, to find somebody you think about just investment bankers. If people, they're doing the same thing and they're looking out and trying to figure out all these different, trying to figure out what the economy is going to be, are there going to be any wars, this and that, and I don't know. It's complex. So we've been talking a lot about the ecological side of things, but I think it's worth noting what you said at the beginning, that at the end of the day, this approach makes ranches more productive, which equals more money for ranchers. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it seems like it's kind of a no-brainer, because it's better for the environment, it's better for the bank account. So what is the main reason what's the main objection you get when you go to a rancher? Obviously there's that inertia. They've been doing things the way they do it. Mm-hmm. Is it because it's just a ton more work?
Well,
or is new, or
it's not necessarily more work. I mean, it might sound like more work, all the stuff I've been talking about here, but it's way more. It's actually less work in many ways, because we end up aggregating our livestock into way fewer herds, which means that you only have so many places you have to go across a big ranch every day to check on things, as opposed to having to check water everywhere.
Yep.
Which is where my wife and I were newlyweds in New Mexico. We had all our cows in one herd. We only had to go to one water point every day to make sure that was good. Usually it was just a matter of opening and shutting gates at a water point into a new pasture to move our cattle. Mm-hmm. And our neighbors thought that was we had a big old workshop going on up there.
Yeah.
Kind of workshop up there, isn't it? They'd tell us. And I'd say, well, I don't know. I only worked 2 hours today. I'm done. And but when they're driving around all day long checking water, because they got 50, 100 cows scattered out across 30 water points, 30 windmills, so they got to check every windmill every day to make sure it's working. Mm-hmm. So in many ways it's not as much work, but it's way harder mentally though, and most people just don't like to sit down and think, and so it takes a certain level of kind of intellectual curiosity and discipline, as I was just talking about, to observe closely and make the necessary adjustments. Because if you do have your herd in your cattle in a great big herd, and you have fairly small pastures, and your grazing periods are 2 to 5 days before they have to move on, and you say, okay, I have 5 days planned in that pasture, so I'm going to stick there for 5 days. If you don't go out there and actually monitor that was a properly calculated grazing period, and if you don't realize that actually the cattle needed to move on day 3.5 or 4, and you keep them in there 5 days, the impact on that is hugely stressful to the livestock, and it's stressful to the land too. So you have to get out there and observe and make the adjustments. And then if you move them a day and a half quicker than you plan, you say, okay, if that continues to happen, if I realize through the course of my grazing plan implementation that I'm overstocked because I'm having to move a day or two quicker in each pasture, what is the implication of that in terms of getting to the end of the season?
Sure.
And so what does that mean in terms of decisions I have to make today?
It's like dominoes. It starts to...
Totally.
Yeah.
So that's the hard part about it. It's just the observational part of it. And most people just get entrenched in habits. Mm-hmm. And we all do this in every aspect of our lives. And habits can be a really good thing if they're constructive habits that build rather than just kind of keep you in a status quo or in a gradually degrading situation. Most ranches have gradually degraded a little bit year after year after year, to the point that ecology suffers, and to the point that it just becomes a non-viable business, and people either have to sell the ranch, kids don't come back, people have to go get part-time jobs in town to subsidize the ranch. None of it works anymore. And so, getting to the economic result is that because we're doing a good job with the ecology, and we're managing our plants the right way and making the plants more productive, and because of the way we're managing the cattle in bigger herds, that changes the way they interact with the landscape, and they get to all corners of the ranch. And in most ranches, you have beat out areas around water points, and then you have the stuff that's over a mile away from the water, over-rested. And so by managing the cattle the way we do, the cattle, in tighter bunches and in bigger herds, the cattle will readily go 2 to 3 miles from water. So all of a sudden, you've doubled the size of your ranch just because you're utilizing the whole thing.
Sure.
and you can therefore run a lot more cattle. And that's with the same overheads, with the same people, the same number of pickups and horses and stock trailers and four-wheelers. So you have the same overhead, but twice the production. All of a sudden your ranch becomes highly profitable. On our Grasslands managed ranches in Montana and South Dakota, our average over the last 6 years, our profit margins have been about 40%. So of every $100 of gross income that we make, about $40 falls to the bottom line.
Did you have numbers on what they were before you took over? Estimates?
No. Well, in some cases we do when we go in. Usually if it's a big ranch that's scaled up well, usually they're marginally profitable, to break even to marginally profitable. But they definitely don't have 40% operating profit margins.
Yeah.
And so the only reason that's possible is because we can drastically increase stocking rate. But again, it takes a lot of effort and observation and skilled management to pull that off without having animal performance wrecks or ecological wrecks.
And then I would imagine when it comes, you're on the ranch for 10 years or so, if you wanted to sell it, you could sell it at a huge premium to what you bought it because it's just a better property all the way around. It's healthier. You've got the data to show that it can run this many cows. I would imagine so you're getting that appreciation on top of the underlying asset.
Yeah, that's definitely a driver in our business model because there obviously is a real estate component too. Even though our guys don't have any explicit selling window, we don't wrap these around a 10-year horizon and say we're going to liquidate in 10 years. But if we do want to sell a ranch, that has value. It especially does in environments like we manage a bunch of country in New Zealand, and the property values are totally tied to how many sheep stock unit equivalents the property can carry. So if you've shown that you've got 5 to 10 years of data carrying a certain stocking rate that's 50 to 100% higher than the previous guy, you can sell that land. You can sell that based on your kind of running average stocking rate. And so, it has huge upside implications, let alone just, like the dollars per stocking rate tends to go up through time also. But if you've also increased the numbers of stock units, the dollars per stock unit tends to go up, just like dollars per acre tends to go up in the United States over time. But if you're running more stock units times a higher dollars per stock unit, it's huge. It's huge real estate appreciation. And so it's not as obvious in the U.S. because you go onto a ranch that's there's some tie to stocking rate in terms of dollars invested per land area that it takes to run a cow unit for the year. And if you're showing that you can run more cow units, that translates into a higher price. But it's as you being in the real estate business, it's kind of hard to go in and say, we've carried twice as many cattle over the last 10 years. Therefore, the ranch is worth twice as much per acre. It doesn't necessarily translate, but still, though.
But if you're managing for wildlife and you have a lot of elk are coming down on the property that used not to be coming there, that's worth a lot.
Big value,
So, I can't believe you. Jim laughed at my list of questions because I have so many, and we've gotten through about 3, I think. One of the reasons I do these interviews is because I meet all these people that are doing very interesting work, but they're also very interesting themselves. They've got really cool backstories. And so how did you get into this? Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? How did you end up where you are now?
Well, I kind of have an unconventional path to this life. My family moved in. My dad's side of the family moved to Western Colorado in the 1890s and became ranchers.
From where?
From England, straight from the lush pastures of southern England. They moved to Western Montrose County, and
straight from England. And back in the open range days, it's still Western Montrose County is still one of the most remote parts of the continental United States. I can't imagine how it must have been 1892. And anyways, they ranched out. They summered out on the western edge of the San Juan Mountains, up on Lone Cone and Little Cone. Yep.
And then they wintered out in the big kind of desert country towards Utah. And they did that again back in the open range days. And when the Homestead Act started kicking in that part of Colorado in the teens, the Homestead Act allowed people to come in and homestead square mile sections. And so all the best water started getting taken up, and it just started to become a fragmented landscape. And my ancestors determined that it no longer worked out there. So they moved over to Montrose and started ranching in the Uncompahgre Valley, farming in the Uncompahgre Valley. My granddad ended up buying some summer country between Montrose and Gunnison. But my dad was an only child, and my granddad was kind of a slave driver. So my dad worked really hard from the time he was about 7 until he got out of high school, and he didn't want anything to do with the ranch or the farm. And he ended up coming to CU, got a football scholarship to play tackle at CU, and so he did that, and then got a teaching credential, and wanted to be a teacher and a coach, and he got a job teaching school in California in 1960. So he moved out there and met my mom, who's from Anaheim, California.
Okay.
And she was a teacher also. But once my dad had been away from the ranch for a few years, and by the time my brothers and I came along, he realized his family had a pretty special thing up in western Colorado. So he insisted that my whole family get back to Colorado most of the summer, which we could do because they were teachers and they had their summers off, and go work for my granddad. But my granddad was a totally different man with myself and my brothers than he was with my dad. And he kind of romanced me into it. Didn't work me nearly as hard as he worked my dad, and let me go fishing and shoot my BB gun as a little kid. It's supposed to just irrigating all day or raking hay all day. So I grew up just enamored with the mountains of Colorado, and detested the fall when I had to go back to California and go back to school. So it was kind of I hated it growing up, but it showed me two different worlds, and it made me realize really what I valued and where I wanted to be.
Choose.
I could choose. Unlike my dad, who didn't know anything other than ranching in the mountains of Colorado. And so that's the path I wanted to be on, but I didn't think I could make a living as a rancher. So I thought I needed to be a veterinarian, livestock veterinarian, and I would be a rancher as a hobby on the side. But about halfway through college, I realized, gosh, I really don't want to be a veterinarian, and I really want to raise healthy animals, but I don't know how to do that and make a living. Simultaneous to that, I started getting more conscious of our land and the plants that were grown on our land, and the fact that, wow, we probably degraded our land significantly because all the willows were gone through our creeks. Our high alpine parks were dominated by Kentucky bluegrass and dandelions.
Wow.
So non-native plants that came in that were resistant to continuous grazing all summer, like we had done forever. And I didn't know what to do about it, though. And until I came across Savory's work, just by great good luck, in the late 80s when I was in college in California, and came across his book and realized, oh my gosh, here's some answers.
Which book was that?
It was Savory's book, Holistic Management. And I recognized the name Savory on the cover. I actually found it just serendipitously at a bookstore in Gunnison.
Really?
I was there to go watch the Cattleman's Days Rodeo, and the parade happens in the morning, the rodeo's in the afternoon. So my dad and I were just killing time. And we went to the bookstore on Main Street there in Gunnison, and there's a book that says Holistic Management, and down below it said Alan Savory, and I recognized Savory because I'd read a little bit about this savory grazing method that he used to call it. But I didn't recognize the word holistic at all. I had no idea what that meant. But I picked it up, and I remember I was obsessed with getting rid of the sagebrush out in our parks, in our high alpine parks in our place. I didn't know what to do about all this freaking sagebrush. And so I immediately go on the index look up brush encroachment, brush removal. I find a few pages, and I go back, I find what's he say? How do I get rid of the brush? He says, typically, most ranchers are obsessed with getting rid of their brush, but that's really the last thing they need to be worried about. I was like, well, that's a different perspective. Usually there's all kinds of other things to throw money at before you start removing your brush and worry about that. Someday that might be the thing to attack, but almost always it's not the place to start. I went, well, that's really an intriguing take on this. And so I flipped through it a little more and immediately realized I had a book there that was going to change my life.
But see, that's interesting because I bet a lot of people would look at that book and they'd read that exact passage and they'd say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and throw it in the trash. But because you're curious, you thought, wow, this. Let's see what else this guy is saying.
I think I was in a space of trying to find answers because I realized that I loved our land more than I loved cows or horses or the ranching culture, even though that was totally that's all I wanted to be, was a cowboy and a rancher. But I didn't want to be, I knew I couldn't be a cowboy and a rancher if it resulted in the degradation of what underpins it all, which is grass.
Yep.
And so I was searching for answers. And so I think I was just in an open-minded spot there. And I was, again, I was going on in my junior year in college, and I didn't grow up on the ranch most of the year. I was in California, in suburban Anaheim, California, going to school and playing football. And then I'd come back and get this dose of high country ranching, but I didn't have any really entrenched habits as I probably would have had if I'd have lived there all year and really gotten, the whole annual cycle drilled into my head. This is how you have to do it.
Yeah, since you were 7 years old, probably like
my dad had. Yeah. So I was just a kind of unique background that just led to my, ability to kind of be open to different ways of looking at things.
And so you've gone to ranches, you've gone to and worked at ranches all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so how did you start doing that?
Well, my granddad actually sold his farm that he had down close to Montrose just before I was born. And that's where they raised all their hay and all their potatoes and wheat that they grew. But he kept all his summer country, which is where I would go all summer as a kid. And so when my wife Daniela and I, when we went to take over the lease of my family's summer country, it was just a summer grazing enterprise. Basically we'd start working on fixing fence in late April as soon as the snow went off. And then we'd finish with our hunters in mid-November. And then we didn't have anything to do from mid-November to mid-April. So we said, what can we do to make a living in the winter? And so I should say, we used to custom graze other people's cattle for them in the winter or during the summertime as well. So when fall came around, we'd ship the cattle back to their owners, and we didn't have any cows to take care of for 4 or 5 months of the year. And so we said, my wife and I both are very keen travelers, and we had traveled a fair bit throughout Zimbabwe and Namibia and South Africa, visiting holistically managed ranches that Savory had put us in touch with. So we said, why don't we create a ranch tourism business, taking people to go visit ranches in other parts of the world, primarily the Southern Hemisphere, where it's summertime during Colorado winter, and let's just do that. So that's we created a business around that, and we eventually put together great groups of ranches that we visited in Argentina, in Australia, and Zimbabwe mainly, but also in South Africa and Namibia. We did a few tours as well. So that's how that came about. It was kind of because we had a seasonal ranch in Colorado, and we had to figure out something to do in the wintertime. So we came up with that idea. We didn't kind of want to get out of ranching, and we wanted to still stay connected to that. And actually, it ended up being really a wonderful education for us. It was a way to keep our heads above water financially in the winter. But it also was a wonderful education because every one of those ranch tours, it was kind of like a mini master's degree.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask I'm sure you've learned, you could write 5 books on it, but is there one particular lesson that sticks out in your head that you learned from one of these international trips that you would have never picked up otherwise?
There's probably a lot of things. I mean, one thing is that there's commonalities everywhere, and we're all human beings with grass and livestock struggling towards kind of similar ends, but the nuances associated with every place are so different. So I think that's one thing. I just learned that we all have kind of this common struggle, but you got to stay flexible with the local specific context that you're managing, and not try to apply recipes anywhere. That's one thing that kind of rubs me wrong. People talk about best management practices, which tend to be too recipe-like. All the stuff I've been talking about in terms of recovery periods that plants need and the different stock densities that are appropriate are totally different from a high rainfall tropical savanna that might get 50, 60 inches of rain in Zimbabwe relative to Monument Valley in eastern Utah, where I used to consult, that gets 8 inches or 7 or 8 inches of rain.
And I would imagine that there are even differences between one in South Park, Colorado, and one in North Park, Colorado.
Totally.
Every one of them is completely different.
There's big differences within ranches themselves, in places that we've managed, depending on elevation and aspect. There's just every pasture takes a nuanced perspective. And so So that just gets really, you become very conscious of that though as you travel around the world and see all these different things. It's all grass and cows and people, but all the details are different. So and there's some basic principles that apply everywhere, but they need to be adapted for the local context.
Got it. Man, I've got so many questions I want to ask you. One thing that I definitely want to hit on that's a little outside of the ranching, but I think is unbelievably interesting, is your running. Because one thing I always keep to myself when I'm talking with ranchers is that I like to do ultra marathons because it instantly makes them think that I'm crazy, which there probably is something wrong.
Definitely.
But I never tell anybody. And here you are, a rancher, a very accomplished rancher who also runs ultra marathons. So how in the world did you get into this as if your job's not physically demanding enough and you've got a family? When did you decide that it was a good idea to start running for 15 hours in the mountains?
Yeah. Well, my job used to be physically demanding back when I was actually a rancher. Because we ranched, the country we ranched in was mostly on edge, as my buddy Tony Malmberg says. And you fight gravity all the time. So you're stringing hot wires across canyons all the time. And you stay in really good shape as a result of that.
Got a good base fitness level.
Yeah. So I stayed fit as a result of just ranching for, the 20 years that I'd ranched. But since we started Grasslands, I spend way more time riding my computer and riding airplanes than I do riding a horse or a four-wheeler or stringing hot wires across canyons now. So I moved to Boulder to be close to Denver International Airport and quit working hard physically. And Boulder has ridiculous dining, and I just gained 20 pounds within a couple of years. And I realized, holy cow, I'm going to die when I'm 50 unless I change my habits here. So I noticed looking outside the window of our apartment in South Boulder, looking across to the Boulder County open space, there were all these people running around out there, running around on trails. And I thought, most people hike trails. How come they're running?
Yeah.
And then I realized there was such thing as trail running. And a guy that works with my wife is from Boulder, happened to be this trail runner, ultramarathon guy. He said, yeah, you should start running if you want to lose some weight. I said, you know what? That sounds better than going to the gym. And so I love being in the mountains. I love being outside. I'm just going to go out and start doing this. So one day I broke the inertia, walked across the street, did my first trail run. And that was 4 years ago. And I tend to be somewhat of an extremist. When I get into something, I just you kind of gradually make these incremental improvements, get better and better. And you think, geez, these people are going out on the weekends and doing these ridiculous races. How the heck did they do that? Mm-hmm. So I just got into what do you got to do to prepare for these ultra marathons, and realized it was in the realm of possibility. It's not, it's hard, but it's totally doable.
It is.
You just got to put the time in. It's amazing what the human body can do. And so as I read about trail running and read Born to Run and learned about the fact that as humans, we're like the ultimate evolved distance runner because we're upright and we can dissipate heat.
Do you agree with his analysis there? I mean, it makes sense to me. I'm just not an anthropologist, or I don't. I mean,
yeah, I totally do.
Yeah,
I think it makes total sense. I mean, we have this nuchal ligament in our back of our head here that keeps our head stable. Uh-huh. Chimpanzees don't even have that ligament, and so we're bipedal, which means we're upright walking. So we don't get direct. Not that much of our body surface area is directly exposed to the sun when you're upright, and we sweat like crazy. Yeah. And so we can dissipate heat. And once you get that base aerobic level, you can just go and go and go.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
For days.
It's nuts.
It is nuts.
Which we can actually do. And and it doesn't take that much to get to that level. So I realized, man, we're physiologically designed to do this. This is what our genetic inheritance is. After 3.5 billion years of evolution, the human Homo sapiens has arrived at this level where we're the ultimate distance runner across, crazy landscapes on trails, not up and down pavement, but up and down mountains and across plains. So I said, that's my evolutionary heritage. I would be ashamed not to tap into my genetic, heritage. And so that's just kind of got me into it. I'm just kind of,
you went straight to the 50, right?
That was my first one, was a 50. Yep. And, I really should have only done 25, but I somehow pushed through that 50.
That's the same thing I did. I've never met I've never met anybody who did that. Most people do marathons first, but I think we might share a loose wire up top, because I just go straight to the 50. And
it's good though.
So if you were giving advice to somebody who wanted to start running and wanted to start doing these ultras, what would it be? Because I'm with you. Everybody thinks it's insane, and if I can do it, anybody can do it. Because running. When I played sports in high school, what I call real sports, running was punishment.
Exactly.
And I hated it.
Yeah, I know.
And so I hated it, and I never thought I had any talent for it. And so if I can go out there and do it, I feel like anybody. So what would your advice be if somebody?
Well, it's just to realize that it'll get comfortable after a while. Once you understand what that aerobic level of running is, it's not like running the mile or the 2 mile or the 800. Where you associate that with kind of middle or long distance running, where you're going hard for that distance, and by the time you finish the race, you're totally depleted. That's not what this is like. You're not out there running at your VO2 max lactate threshold the whole time. You get into this groove, and you can just go and go and go, and you don't run out of aerobic capacity. Your body just starts to ache, and you kind of get into this extreme state of exhaustion. That's a big part of ultra running. So if you're not really into that side of it, or like the idea of pushing through kind of your human limits in terms of pushing through exhaustion, then it's probably not for you. But it's not like this negative thing tied to running. It's more this mental exercise of pushing through limits that you didn't know you really could push through. And the running side of it can get comfortable after a while. And so don't try to go out and do something ridiculous to start with if you haven't been running much. Just like I started with 3 mile circles that I did probably 20 times at 3 mile before I expanded it a little bit more. And then you just little by little just keep expanding your distance and expanding your elevation, and just keep your heart rate there in that aerobic range, so that you're not building up lactic acid in your muscles. Yep. And you can just go and go and go. And also realize that when we say ultra running, most of it isn't actually running. All the uphills are basically hiking, walking. It's impossible to run the uphills unless you're a guy like Scott Jurek or Tony Krupishka that are genetic anomalies. Or Killian Hornet.
Oh yeah, wow! Guy did the hard rock in 19 hours.
So, anyway, there's a few crazy people that can run up the hills, but most of us can't. So just realize that you actually get to walk a lot in the process of doing an ultra marathon, and you get to run all the downhills, and that's really fun to run downhill.
I think when I'm doing a race, I try to push it a little in training just for the training's sake, but in races, my goal is never get out of breath. Just always, just never get to the point where you're breathing hard. And I think, in my experience, nutrition is a key. Because I remember when I was training for my first one, I just kept getting whipped and whipped and whipped. And I kept experimenting with different nutrition, and I finally got what worked for me. And everybody's different. And once I figured it out, I mean, really, you could go for 2 days straight. If you've got that base fitness and you're eating and drinking and doing the electrolytes correctly, who knows how long you can go. It's amazing. I
mean, you still get exhausted, and aching, but you can maybe exhaustion. I mean, you do. I mean, after you're out there for 15 plus hours, you're tired. But it's amazing how you can just keep going though. And like you say, a key component of it is it's not to exhaust you. It's not to get out of wind, but it's also to keep the energy flow going into your body, the energy plus the electrolytes, and keeping your body fueled. If you stay fueled, you can just keep going. It's crazy.
I've also found we could talk about this for 3 hours, but what I've recently started doing, I used to do a lot of gels just because I thought that's what you're supposed to do, and they sell them everywhere. But I've found that nut butters like almond butter or that kind of stuff works even better because it's that fat. And I'm never at a point where I'm breathing hard enough to really need that just pure sugar like you would in a triathlon or something like that. And so that kind of slow, I think of it as coal versus jet fuel. You want that slow burning kind of fuel that allows you to go for hours and hours versus pure sugar. All right, well, unfortunately I can't kidnap you and make you stay here and talk to me all day. So the way I've been finishing up these interviews is with some real quick questions, and you can answer them as long as you want, but I think there have been some great answers, and I've gotten turned on to some books and different things that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. So if you could recommend one book or two on your line of work. I recommend your book, so you don't have to recommend it.
Sure.
But I highly recommend it. Yeah. That one's definitely worth reading over and over and over. So one book on your business, and then one book that you just have gotten a lot out of, either personally, professionally, whatever.
I would say there's a book that Alan Nation wrote called Knowledge Rich Ranching. And so it covers a lot of the stuff that I've talked about here. Alan Nation is the editor of the Stockman Grass Farmer, which is kind of the monthly periodical that all of us kind of alternative thinking ranchers get. So Knowledge Rich Ranching in my space. There's another one, I'm going to say two. Another one is called No Risk Ranching by Greg Judy, which is the subtitle is Custom Grazing on Leased Land. So it's a good model for people that don't have a lot of capital that want to ranch. You don't have to own cows and land to ranch. You can run other people's cattle on other people's land and be a rancher. This is what we did for years. We leased my parents' place and leased our neighbor's place and ran other people's cattle. And it was great. And that's actually what we do in the Northern Great Plains also. We all custom graze all our cattle in Montana and South Dakota. So there's ways to ranch without being a multimillionaire. And those books tell you how to do that. It's all about this knowledge stuff, which comes back to all this stuff tied to planned grazing and increased stocking rates. It's all covered in that book. And I would say outside of my space, I've read a book recently that just absolutely fascinated me, which is it's called Natural Born Heroes by Christopher McDougall.
I was actually just thinking about that book this morning, and I put it on my list to read.
Yeah.
I saw something
That's awesome.
about it. Is it really good?
McDougall's the guy that wrote Born to Run,
I've heard it's great.
Yeah, it's really cool because it's about the Cretians on the island of Crete during World War II and how they basically sabotaged the Nazi army there. Crete was like this major kind of resupply point and logistical point for the Nazi army to supply their eastern front. And the Cretians totally screwed that up.
Yeah.
And there were these little Cretan dudes that could haul butt over mountains, that could do these ultra marathons we're talking about, and picking weeds along the way and eating weeds to fuel themselves.
Wow.
And figured out burning fat, and it's all your own body fat, and so it's all about this ultra running basically, but in the context of a war.
Oh, cool.
And how these people developed that being shepherds, this shepherding culture, shepherding goats and sheep in these insanely rough mountains on Crete. So it's got this pastoralism component, it's got this ultra running component, it's got this fascinating military history component. And it's got all kinds of Greek mythology in there too, that kind of drive the Cretan mindset. And it's also got all the special forces stuff in there because the British special forces guys came in and worked with the Cretan shepherds to overcome. It's like if you got my bookshelf
Nazis. And just condensed it in.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
It's got all this nutrition stuff in there too. It's just fascinating how it ties all that together in just a totally skillful story.
I'll put it at the top of my list.
Definitely.
I'm glad to hear that because I was just thinking about it this morning.
Cool.
Any favorite documentaries?
Gosh, the one that just popped in my mind is Senna.
I haven't seen that.
It's about I can't remember his first name. He's a Brazilian race car driver.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's his story, and it's fascinating.
Really?
Just the focus on perfection and just discipline and preparation and toughness that guy, you don't really think about that in a race car driver, but this guy was incredible. It was recommended to me by the guy I work with, Zach, who I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
And one night I just clicked on Senna.
That's interesting.
Oh my God, it was an awesome documentary. So that's good.
That's why I asked these questions. I got my list gets longer and longer. Let me see. Do you have a specific favorite location, either in the West or because of all your international travel in the world? Is there one place that if you had to say, that's my favorite? I don't know the answer. I don't have my own answer.
Yeah, I would say it's still the little creek that runs through our ranch in Colorado. Mm-hmm. Actually, my family sold the ranch 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. It was the right thing to do in aggregate for my family, my mom and dad and my brothers. But we maintained what's called a life estate up on that on our cabin up there, which means we can continue to use it as long as one of my parents is alive. And so that cabin is right up above a little creek called the Little Blue, and that's where I spent most of my summers with a fly rod down on Little Blue snagging brook trout. And that's still my favorite little valley and creek and spot in the world right there. Thankfully, we can still go back and use that special in the summer's time. That's my favorite spot. Yep.
And so next to the last question is if you could make a request of the people listening to this, and it's a wide array of people, everybody from climbers to ranchers to basically people who have a connection to the land out west. Is there something you would ask them to learn more about, to research, a cause you're particularly passionate about?
Well, I mean, a cause that I'm passionate about is kind of making the world aware that herbivory, which is the grazing of forages by big ruminant animals, can be a good thing, and to not villainize livestock, because they're just a tool, and it's the humans that are responsible for those livestock that's the issue. And so, and we're not gonna heal the grasslands of the world without livestock. We can't remove humans and remove their livestock and expect it all to come right. The humans are still going to be out there. The cattle and the sheep and the camels and the horses and everything are still going to be out there. And all it takes is a readjustment of how those same elements interact to go from a state of degradation to a state of increasing abundance. And really, that's a big driver of our work, is realizing that, we've lost all this biodiversity and associated soil carbon from the soils that are associated with these grasslands. It's a huge carbon sink that can go a long way to mitigating the climate change impacts that we're all confronted with over our kids are in a world of hurt unless we can simultaneously figure out how to quit combusting fossil fuels at the rate that we're doing, and simultaneously sequester an enormous amount of the overload of carbon that's in the atmosphere now. So we think by managing these 5 billion hectares, 12 billion acres of the world's grasslands in a more responsible way, and getting them back to a state of abundance as opposed to a state of degradation that they're in now, some calculations indicate that we can actually sequester the overload of carbon that's in the atmosphere right now back, if we can do this over these 5 billion hectares of grasslands. It's going to take a long time to do that, but it's mostly about training human beings. But that's the message that my wife's side of our business, called the Savory Institute, is working on every day, trying to make people conscious of the fact that humans can be a keystone species out there in these landscapes. We already are the keystone species, but for the most part, we're kind of an unconscious, degrading keystone species. We can become a conscious building species as opposed to this degrading keystone species. So that's kind of a long answer, but that's just it. People just need to become conscious that it's a bigger issue than just removing cows and preserving it. That's not a practical solution.
Perfect summary of your work and your book. I think that's what people need to hear. So if people want to find out more about you, more about Grasslands, Savory, what's the best way to do that?
Well, we have websites for both of us. Grasslands-llc.com is ours. So we have an email there, contact email there, that you can get a hold of us with any questions that usually get sent to me, which is fine. And then the Savory Institute has a way more professional website than the Grasslands does. And they're much better at getting back to people also. And so that's my wife's side of it. That's savory.global is their website.
Okay. And I'll have links to everything in the notes.
Okay.
All right, that was great. Again, I really appreciate it. And we'll have to have part 2, 3, 4, and 5 to cover the rest of my questions.
Good.
Thanks a lot.
All right, you bet.
So there you go, Jim Howell. I told you he's an interesting guy. Between the ranching and the running and the world traveling, he's got lots of great stories to tell, and he's doing very important work. I can't recommend his book enough, For the Love of Land. There are links to it on this webpage. Go check it out. I recommend it to people all the time, and I highly recommend it to you. It's an easy book to read, and it's packed with great information. Again, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, don't hesitate to reach out. Let me know if you have ideas for other people that I should interview. I appreciate your time. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.